In the quiet, climate-controlled halls of the world's great libraries, there are objects that feel like they shouldn't exist. Not because they are myth or legend, but because they look like they slipped in from the wrong chapter of history. This is one of them. In 1531, a French mathematician and master cartographer named Oronce Finé drew a map of the world. At first glance, it's a beautiful Renaissance artifact. A double heart-shaped projection, decorative borders, Latin inscriptions, the usual elegance of the age. But if you let your eyes drift to the bottom of the map, something is very wrong. Spread across the southern edge of the world, hugging the pole, there is a huge, detailed continent. It has mountain ranges, it has valleys, it has coastlines and the mouths of rivers. It is labeled Terra Australis, the southern land. And here's the problem. Antarctica was not officially sighted by modern explorers until the early 1800s. This map was printed almost 300 years earlier. So how does a 16th century scholar, who never left Europe, draw something that looks disturbingly like a real southern continent? Today, we're going to peel back the layers of the Oronce Finé map and ask a question that makes a lot of historians uncomfortable. Is this just a brilliant guess, or a trace of knowledge that shouldn't exist in 1531? Let's start with the man behind the map. Oronce Finé was not a crank on the fringes of academia. He was appointed chair of mathematics at the Collège Royal in Paris by King Francis I. He was an astronomer, a geometer, a designer of scientific instruments, and one of the most respected mathematical minds of his time. In the 1530s, cartography was the space race of Europe. Every voyage by Columbus, Vespucci, Magellan, and others brought back conflicting scraps of coastlines and islands. Mapmakers were the data scientists of the age, trying to fuse all these messy reports into a single coherent picture of the Earth. When Finé published his world map in 1531, it was admired as a technical masterpiece. But what fascinates us today is not Europe, or the New World, or Asia. It's that southern landmass. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who simply left the southern hemisphere as a vague, empty ocean, Finé filled his with a fully developed continent. And it doesn't just sit there as a random decorative blob. The outline has a shape. Certain bays and peninsulas seem to echo real features on modern maps of Antarctica. If you take Finé's Terra Australis and compare it to Antarctica as seen from above, the similarities are uncomfortable. Parts of the southern coastline line up shockingly well with what we now call the Ross Sea and the Weddell Sea. It looks, at first glance, like a crude but recognizable version of Antarctica. And then comes the detail that turns a curious map into a genuine mystery. On Finé's map, the southern continent is not smothered in ice. The coastline is clean. Rivers appear to flow inland. There are no massive ice shelves drawn as barriers. It looks like a mapped landmass, not a guessed-at wall of ice. For that to be accurate in any meaningful way, someone would have had to observe those coasts when conditions were very different from today. That is the moment where the map stops being just interesting and starts to feel like a glitch in our timeline. In the 1960s, this puzzle caught the attention of a historian of science named Charles Hapgood, working in New Hampshire. Hapgood was not a random fringe writer. He was a university lecturer, and his ideas about shifts in the Earth's crust were taken seriously enough that Albert Einstein wrote a foreword to one of his books. Hapgood decided to treat the Oronce Finé map as data. He painstakingly converted Finé's elegant double heart projection into a modern grid. Then he compared the positions of features on Terra Australis to known topography in Antarctica. He was looking for a simple answer. Is this just artistic decoration, or is there any real geography hiding inside? To his surprise, he found what he believed were specific correspondences. In Hapgood's reading, the outlines of Finé's southern continent line up with parts of Antarctica's coastline, including regions we now know are hidden beneath ice. He focused especially on what he identified as the Ross Sea region. On Finé's map, this area appears as open water, with coastal details and island-like forms. Today, that same region is largely covered by the Ross Ice Shelf, a floating slab of ice the size of a large country. Modern oceanographic research in the Ross Sea has recovered sediments that appear to have been laid down by rivers flowing into an open body of water tens of thousands of years ago. The exact dates and interpretations are debated, but the broad picture is clear. Antarctica's ice sheets have not always looked exactly as they do today. There were periods in the past when parts of the coastline were less icebound and more actively shaped by water. Hapgood joined these clues together into a single, bold idea. He argued that Oronce Finé and other mapmakers like Piri Reis were not inventing these details. They were copying fragments from much older source maps, drawn by a seafaring civilization that existed long before Egypt, Sumer, or Greece. He called them the Ancient Sea Kings. In Hapgood's scenario, at the end of the last ice age, a sophisticated maritime culture charted coastlines all over the world, including Antarctica, when its coastal ice was thinner and sea levels were different. When that civilization collapsed, perhaps due to catastrophic climate shifts and sea level rise, its knowledge didn't vanish overnight. It survived in copied charts, stored in centers of learning like the Library of Alexandria, then scattered after its destruction and eventually inherited by Renaissance scholars. In this view, Finé's world map is a kind of palimpsest, part 16th century science, part fossilized memory of a world mapped thousands of years earlier. That would explain why his Terra Australis seems, at times, remarkably accurate, and at other times, wildly wrong. He was, according to this theory, trying to stitch together incredibly old, high-quality data with the incomplete discoveries of his own era. If Hapgood is right, the Oronce Finé map is not just a pretty Renaissance artifact. It is a window into a lost chapter of human history. It would suggest that the official timeline of civilization, the one in textbooks, skips over a whole earlier cycle of exploration and knowledge. It's an intoxicating idea. But a serious investigation cannot stop there. Most professional historians and cartographers do not accept Hapgood's conclusion. For them, the Oronce Finé map is striking, but not evidence of a forgotten global civilization. Their explanation starts with psychology and philosophy, not secret empires. Early mapmakers often suffered from what scholars call horror vacui, a discomfort with leaving parts of the page blank. They inherited from classical thinkers like Aristotle the idea of the antipodes, that there should be a balancing southern landmass to counterweigh the continents in the north. In other words, a big southern continent wasn't a shocking revelation. It was expected. Add to this the fresh reports coming in from Magellan's expedition, which had skirted around what we now know as the tip of South America and glimpsed the islands of Tierra del Fuego. Many European scholars thought those islands were the northern edge of a vast, unknown southern continent. From that perspective, what did Oronce Finé do? He took the philosophical expectation of a southern land, the new fragmentary reports from real voyages, his own mathematical sense of symmetry and balance, and filled in the blank space with what he believed a southern continent should look like: mountains, rivers, capes, and inlets. Critics of Hapgood point out that parts of Finé's southern continent look nothing like Antarctica at all. The landmass is far too large, stretching almost into subtropical latitudes. Some coastal shapes that are claimed to match Antarctica only do so loosely, and only if you rotate, scale, and reinterpret them. To them, the supposed matches are classic pattern seeking, the human brain's habit of seeing meaningful shapes in noise. If you stare at enough decorative lines on enough old maps, eventually some of them will remind you of modern coastlines purely by chance. And yet, the nagging coincidences don't go away. Why does Finé's southern land have any segments that look as if they line up with Antarctica at all? Why do some of these segments echo features that were only mapped in detail in the 20th century, using technologies he could not have imagined? Is it all just the cartographic equivalent of seeing shapes in clouds? This is where the Oronce Finé map refuses to be neatly filed away. It sits in a gray zone between obvious myth and obvious data. Too accurate in places to dismiss, too inaccurate in others to canonize as proof. So what do we do with it? One option is to go all in on the lost civilization narrative. ancient sea kings, global cartography before recorded history, advanced knowledge erased by catastrophe. It is a powerful story. It sells books and documentaries. Another option is to stay with the mainstream view. A brilliant Renaissance mathematician, influenced by classical philosophy and incomplete exploration reports, produced a map that is partly insightful, partly wrong, and only accidentally reminiscent of Antarctica. There is also a more cautious middle ground. Maybe Finé did have access to some older charts. Not the hyper-advanced maps imagined by Hapgood, but fragments of earlier coastal sketches made by unknown sailors in the centuries before Europe's documented age of exploration. Maybe those charts were better in some regions, worse in others, and Finé combined them with theory and imagination. In that case, the Oronce Finé map would still be extraordinary, not because it proves a lost super-civilization, but because it shows how fragile our picture of the past really is. How much can be forgotten, and then half-remembered, and then miscopied into something that looks both familiar and alien at the same time. Whatever explanation you favor, one thing is hard to deny. This map forces us to confront how little we actually know about the full history of human curiosity. We like to think of our timeline as a clean, upward line, from ignorance to knowledge, from blank maps to satellite images. But artifacts like Finé's world map are like cracks in that story. They hint that the path may be far messier, full of dead ends, forgotten breakthroughs, and perhaps entire explorations that left only faint fingerprints. Next time you look at a modern satellite image of Antarctica, a white mass at the bottom of the globe, remember that 5 centuries ago, a mathematician in Paris drew a southern continent that looks, in places, uncomfortably familiar. Was he just guessing into the void? Or was he, without realizing it, tracing the ghost of a much older world? If the mystery of the 1531 map captured your imagination, hit like and subscribe to Veil Origins. Here, we sift through the anomalies, the maps, experiments, and artifacts that don't quite fit, and ask what they might really be telling us. Veil Origins. Impossible Truths.